Hi, one of the things I'd like to basically just give you is the idea of creativity. Very often in life we're brought up to believe that there are creative people and there are academic people, and these two types of people are different. But in fact, creativity is a function of the human mind. Unfortunately, in the society we live in, that when we're brought up, we're not taught anything about creativity. But everybody has the possibility of creativity, and what it isn't is actually just thinking about an idea for a couple of minutes and thinking, oh, I'll just turn it upside down or turn it around. It's very much connected with this idea that we hear a lot about today, and that is thinking outside of the box. And that's a good metaphor, because what it does is it tells us something about something I talk about a lot, and that is values, beliefs, and the framework that we use within our mental body, as it were, our minds, in order to navigate life on a daily basis. So because of that box that we live in, which is very useful to us, we tend not to go outside of it. We tend not to get creative about ideas. But just a little thought about how in this day and age, companies, startups, individuals who are trying to change their lives and create really fantastic changes, they're forced into the situation where they think we've got to get creative about it. But how do you do that? It helps to have a good overview of what it means to step outside of the box. And what scares people about creativity is that you have to start thinking and possibly voicing ideas that sound a bit wild, stupid, wacky and mad. But that is the process of creativity. If you don't if you don't have the guts to just trust yourself and think in a divergent way about an idea, then it's quite possible that you're not going to get anywhere with creativity. If you take the idea of the people who are the most creative, the people that we know in society come up with brilliant ideas every day, and that is artists. How does an artist work? One thing they don't do is plan. One thing they don't do is say, I'm going to write a book and then plan it word for word. They can't plan it word for word. They can plan it chapter to chapter. And I think most writers would tell you that chapter to chapter changes as they go along. And the reason for that is because creative process is happening. If you take an idea, and as a writer, you think about this. If you ever listen to a writer who's written a book and they're asked, how did you get on this idea? They'll tell you quite often that they had a thought, they had an idea about a concept, about an idea, and it just kept nagging at them all of the time. This idea seemed to be very important. And so they began to explore it. But the thing about a story is it's a narrative. And the thing about narrative is very long. The human mind is not capable of actually being able to enclose itself around a whole narrative and see it and feel it and understand it in one go, which is why techniques are used in order to explore the idea of the whole story. It's only through reading it that we can actually experience it. It's only through sitting down and beginning to write that a novelist or writer will actually discover what the hell it is he's writing about, or she. There's two points here that happen. You can get boring books and you can get really great stories. And I would say that in the boring books, what happens sometimes is that the author has not been very creative about what happens. Because as soon as you begin to write about a character or a situation, your mind is kicked into the creative process. But it can really easily make associations which offer themselves to the author in a way which means that they think that that's the next thing that happens. For example, you say that there's a man sitting in his office, he's a private detective, and he's waiting for the phone to ring. That's pretty cliche. But the problem with that is the mind will naturally think there's a door in the room, and so the door swings open. Somebody steps in. that person pulls a gun. All of this is very cliche, but this is the mind making associations which are from memory of watching other movies or reading books about detectives and private eyes. But what if you said, as an author, I don't accept that, it's not good enough. So the guy's sitting in his office, he's waiting, it's just the beginning of the story, the door flies open and a woman walks in and pulls a gun. Okay, pretty cliche. So there's going to be a situation in the room which is one of fear. So who's got the fear? The guy sitting at the desk, having the gun pointed at him. But what if you said, I know what the next thing is, that he's going to try and do something and she might pull the trigger. But what about if you turned the fear around and tried to make the woman frightened? You ask yourself a question. What's happening there is you're not making associations, you're beginning to become divergent in your thinking and thinking, how can I make it so that really that fear in the room is dominant in the woman's feelings or emotions, the woman who is holding the gun, pointing it at the man sitting at the desk. That at least is a beginning of turning things around. But what's really happening there in the mind is that you're becoming divergent in your thinking. You're breaking up the pattern. That's creative thinking. So you could say, okay, so the cliche is let's say she's a real killer and the only thing she wanted to do is walk in there, not have a chat with him, but pull the trigger and kill him. She's a cold-hearted assassin. So she points the gun, she pulls the trigger and it goes click. She's shocked. She pulls the gun back, takes a look, there's bullets in the barrel. She checks the chamber, it's cocked, it's ready to go. So she pulls the trigger again, and then she pulls it another 5 times and nothing happens. It's just clonk, clonk, clonk. She can't understand what's going on. She's starting to get frightened and confused. So you've pushed the fear across to the person who was in fact the one who was supposed to be creating fear. It's an interesting little idea, but for me, it wouldn't be totally really creative thinking. It's just reversing something, but it is divergent thinking. It is how the brain begins to work when you are attempting to be creative. Because one of the wonderful things about creativity, it's like an animal on its own. It'll go sort things out. It'll go find things. It'll bring them back and offer them to you. It'll offer you ideas. And that's when you have to be very open. If you're not open-minded about the ideas that come back to you, then you're not really going to start going down the creative process. But what we just talked about is the idea that creativity is opening your mind to be able to explore an idea, begin to make associations with the idea, not losing sight of the idea, but yet make associations and explore those associations, don't accept them as the result or the final idea, but use them as the first stepping stone to go into real creativity where you start thinking in a more divergent way. This way, you're practicing the art of creativity. It can go on for hours, days, years, depending on what people are doing. If you're a company, or if you're a startup, or if you're an individual thinking about how am I going to change my life, I think that really, you've got to accept the fact that it depends how big the idea is or how big the idea is that you want to have on whether it's going to turn out to be a very long process or a very short process. But what you can't do is do what some companies try and do, and that is basically get creative people into their company, tell them to be creative, but tell them how to do it by putting them in a box. I mean, it's so counterproductive. It's not going to help. Individuals try this as well, and they discover it doesn't work in their own lives. So, it doesn't work, and they say, I'm not a creative person. But that's really just a load of old bollocks. You are a creative person. You just need to understand that it isn't something you can use in a sense of pushing a button. You can't say, a creative person can figure this one out, and then get a creative person and say, figure this out for us, and I'll come back in 20 minutes and I need to have your creativity. It doesn't work like that at all. That's the reality of life. Unfortunately, business, corporations, policies, rules and regulations, they're not the reality of life. They're actually trying to harness ideas and processes which have been created, which are artificial processes. Creativity is actually a function of the human mind, and it's powerful. If you think of the way in which a painter paints. They have an idea and they want to explore that idea on canvas. So they begin by daubing the canvas with the paintbrush. As the paintbrush goes on, it creates one daub or piece of colour. And that piece of colour will actually create an idea in the mind of an association, which will be the next daub of paint onto the canvas. But the third daub of paint must also be associated with the second and first. But it must never forget the first idea, and that third and fourth. And when there's paint all over the canvas, each brushstroke must be relative to the idea. In the same way as the author writing a story, and when he gets to page 200 or 300, what he's writing must be relevant to the kernel idea of the whole story. If it isn't, he's gone off on a tangent, and tangents are just meandering thought. They're looking for something, but they're not ideas. They are not the kernel idea, and they're just the creative process, hunting, looking, seeking. But they might just find a point where they can stop and say, this is interesting. And the reason why the mind will say it's interesting, because it is, in one way or another, somehow, it's associated with the kernel idea.